Hello, it's Deena Thomson, author of Fallen Poppies, and this is Chapter 5.
Chapter 5. JoBeth sat on the mattress, listening intently to Oliver, as Shauna slept peacefully in her arms. As the pale hair fanned across the older girl's lap, she stroked it absent-mindedly. "We all gradually hooked up with one another," Oliver said, his voice light and casual. His elbows rested comfortably on his legs as his hands dangled freely between his knees. JoBeth could not help noticing the troubled way Alan looked at Oliver. She shook off the feeling of animosity and turned her attention back to Oliver. "So you don't have any parents?" she inquired, facing him. His eyes danced with amusement. "Not one of us has a parent. They're either dead or just up and left." He smiled and leaned in closer to JoBeth. "What about you? Where are your parents?" JoBeth darted her eyes away and began staring at her hands in her lap. Her nails were broken and black, and the lines in the palm of her hand were embedded with dirt. She nervously began to stroke Shauna's soft blonde locks. Tears tried to force themselves to the surface, but she swallowed them back. "I have no parents. We're alone." "Is Shauna your sister?" Jonah asked, sitting behind Tamara. He had been silently listening to them. JoBeth's gaze lingered on the young black man, still startled by his color. His clothes were threadbare and his hair was matted, but his face glowed with intelligence. She had never been this close to a person of color before. Of course, she saw people like him only a few times from afar. Blacks and whites never spoke to each other. She was embarrassed to admit it, but had never paid much attention to the colored folks. They were part of the scenery, standing on a corner or in the store, there, yet not, simply blending into the background, like a painting hanging on the wall, untouchable. Alan noticed her uneasiness and sensed she was not used to addressing colored folks. Studying her tired face, he saw only kindness. She had probably never spoken to a black person before. Once she got to know Jonah, she would love him like everyone else did. Even Tamara, who hated everyone and everything, loved Jonah. "I think it's time we let our guest sleep," Alan announced, still looking at her. Relieved, JoBeth's eyes met his. He tried again to smile warmly at her, but it only came out twisted, making him look ridiculous. "But we want to hear more," Tamara chided, lying back on her side, her head resting snugly on her propped hand. She smiled sweetly. JoBeth ignored her. She was tired and did not want to answer any more questions. Too many questions would lead to too many truths, which was the last thing she wanted them to know. Then they would throw her out and keep Shauna. They could never know the truth about what had happened to her. She would never let that happen. "There's plenty of time to talk," Alan interrupted, scowling at Tamara. "That is, if JoBeth decides to stay with us." He held his breath, afraid of the answer. He could not explain it, but he felt the need to protect her and her little sister. JoBeth stared at Alan, open-mouthed. She hadn't thought of staying permanently. "Please stay, JoBeth," Oliver repeated, leaning even closer to her. "Well, I don't know," she stumbled, still feeling a little frightened of these people. Tamara's face was red with anger. Her friendly smile was now gone. Did she want to spend the whole winter with a girl who obviously did not like her and felt threatened by her? Tamara's expression to Oliver was one of disgust. She flopped herself flat on the mattress, turning her back to them. "There is no need for her to answer that question," Alan answered JoBeth. "We all can leave any time we want, and so can JoBeth. Stay as long as you want." He lay down on the mattress and yawned, his eyes never leaving JoBeth. "Lots to do tomorrow. Better get some shut-eye." She stared back, grateful. Alan nodded as she snuggled in beside Shauna. Oliver stood up and went to the mattress Tamara was sleeping on. Lying beside her, he whispered something into her ear. and she elbowed him roughly in the stomach. He chuckled, said something JoBeth could not hear, and crawled onto a mattress with another boy. Smiling at Oliver's behavior, Jonah crept away from the fighting couple and over to Alan's mattress. He laid his bulky frame down, not noticing the difference between his frame and Alan's lean one. "I like her," Jonah whispered to Alan's rigid back. "Me too," Alan whispered back, wide-eyed, staring at JoBeth's already sleeping form. "Me too." JoBeth awoke refreshed and in good spirits for the first time in a long time. She sat up, stiff and confused, unable to remember where she was. Suddenly she became frightened. Where was she? Her head spun around from side to side, taking in the objects around her. Then the events of the past evening flooded her memory. Alan and Oliver. Tamara. It all came back in a rush. She turned to check on Shauna and smiled at the sleeping child beside her. The poor thing was completely exhausted from the past month's activities. She pulled the blanket Oliver had given her over Shauna's frail shoulders and lightly kissed her warm cheek. "Good morning," boomed a deep voice. JoBeth spun around to face Jonah. Her hand clasped her heart. She did not know what to do. Jonah towered over her, casting a large shadow behind her on the wall. "Good morning," JoBeth said, reserved, her eyes avoiding him. She remembered when Mother Tomalina had been offered a black baby. She had refused, stating that there was no way she was having one of those kinds in her home. The comment puzzled JoBeth. She had been in the kitchen peeling potatoes at the sink when the nice-looking lady with brown hair and a straw hat had come to the door holding the dark, crying infant. The baby was dressed in a darling white crocheted bonnet and dress that flattered the infant's chocolate-colored skin. "But, Miss Johnston, the child has nowhere to go. You are my last hope," the lady begged, bouncing the infant in her arms. The baby flailed its tiny feet, knocking off one of the matching white booties, exposing a brown foot with a pinkish underside. JoBeth leaned closer to the door to listen, her knife poised over a half-peeled potato. Mother Tomalina always wanted babies. For reasons unknown to JoBeth, Mother Tomalina had a soft spot for them. Maybe it was because they didn't yet have a personality to offend her, or perhaps they did not look at her drawn, wrinkled face with disgust. Whatever the reason, it did not last long. As soon as the child was old enough to walk, Mother Tomalina would have nothing to do with it. "No, now leave with that thing now." She ordered the lady out of the house. "Bring me a white child, even an Indian, but never bring those soulless creatures into my home," she ordered. "I will not have the children of Ham under my roof." The woman left enraged, and Mother Tomalina went to pray. As soon as JoBeth was sure the old crone was deep in prayer, she left the potatoes in the sink and went outside. She bent down where the baby had kicked off the booty and picked it up. The yarn was silky to the touch. JoBeth couldn't help herself and rubbed the small garment on her cheek, feeling its warm, comforting touch. Memories of her mother flooded her. Mama is sitting in her favorite chair knitting, humming a tune. JoBeth was seated on the ground reading a novel, asking questions about different people in the book, strange people who looked and lived very differently from everything she knew. Her mind was filled with endless questions. Why were there people who believed in different things than she did? Why did they look so unlike her and those around her? Were they less human, more like animals? Her thoughts raced, eager to find the answers. Her mother put down her knitting, motioned JoBeth to sit before her. JoBeth listened. Constance Roberts began to braid her daughter's long golden brown hair. Warmth and safety enveloped JoBeth. In a calm voice, her mother replied as best she could. "Some feel those who are different are inferior to us," Mama said, her fingers expertly twisting hair into a braid. But no human is or should be called an animal. She paused. Remember, my dear, we are all God's children, and in the end, when we are in heaven, all color fades to a bright light, and there is only love in that light. She placed her hands on Jo Beth's shoulders and gently turned her daughter to face her. Their eyes connected with each other, linked together like one. Do you understand what I'm saying? Her mother nodded her head. Jo Beth averted her eyes, not really sure she did understand. She felt her mother cup her chin. We are all light, Constance Roberts declared, all parts of the same light, one. We are all one. Jo Beth looked at the little booty, and the warmth she had felt when her mother braided her hair lingered. She kicked off her tattered shoes, exposing her bare feet. Wiggling her toes, she looked at the soles of her feet. They were wrinkled and pink. She gently folded the booty and placed it in the pocket of her dress. Jo Beth looked at Jonah, ashamed. The visions of the past played out in her mind. What would her mother say if she was here? His size was threatening, but his face and smile were kind and genuine. I owe you an apology, she said, looking at his confused features. Whatever for? Jonah handed Jo Beth some bread. I'm afraid I have judged you unfairly. She looked down at her hand, holding the bread Jonah had given her. Aw, you ain't the first. He smiled brightly. And you won't be the last. Everyone does when they first meet me. It's 'cause I so big for my age and I so dark and all. Least you say you're sorry. Don't normally get so sorry from folks. Jo Beth felt her apprehension starting to leave. I guess you had a good sleep? Jonah asked, coming close. He sat on the nearest mattress to Jo Beth. Sit down, Jo Beth. Sit down. He patted the mattress beside him. Jo Beth walked over and sat down uneasily beside the massive youth. Too many things had changed in her life in such a short period. It was hard for her to overcome. She had never spoken to a black person before, and now she sat inches away from one. She couldn't help feeling dirty around people. After what Father James had done to her, why would anyone want to be around her? She closed her eyes and took a bite of the dry bread. I am not going to think about that. Jonah smiled and chuckled through a mouthful of food. It looks like you got the weight of the world on your little bitty shoulders. I do? She twisted her hands, surprised at her outburst. She nibbled on her bread, angry with herself for revealing too much. Where is everyone? Jo Beth gazed around the empty room, trying to change the subject. They all gone to town. Jonah smiled broadly, displaying a mouthful of teeth that seemed to take up his whole face. She liked his smile. She relaxed again. The images of Father James were forced to the back of her mind. Mama was right. Everyone is God's child. We has to treat the newcomers with class, Jonah continued, wiping away breadcrumbs from his mouth with his massive paw of a hand. Bread won't do for the feast we gonna have tonight. He lifted his crust to Jo Beth's face. Instantly her stomach growled at the mention of a feast. It had been so long since she had eaten a good meal, she wondered if Shauna had ever eaten one. She felt warm inside, thinking of the child feasting on good, nutritious foods. Jonah continued, noticing the hunger in Jo Beth's eyes. Carter and Adam are at work, but promised to bring home a little extra for dinner. He grinned at her bashfully, his brown eyes twinkling with life. Are you hungry, Jo Beth? She blushed, ashamed that her hunger showed so plainly. I am only hungry for Shauna, Jo Beth said with little conviction while sweeping the crumbs off her skirt. Yeah, I know how it is to be hungry for someone else. Jonah laughed. Jo Beth couldn't help herself. She began to chuckle too. She sounded ridiculous. The sides of Jonah's eyes creased and wrinkled with laugh lines. She wondered how old he was. Despite his large frame, he had a boy's face, kind and gentle, not yet ruined by the world's cruelties. "Jonah," JoBeth asked, "how old are you?" She blushed. She felt like her tongue did not belong to her. She had lost all sense of the good manners she had been raised with. Tears burned behind her eyes. Could Jonah not see what a fraud she was? But she suddenly really needed his kindness and offer of friendship. "You are all so young," she said, trying to recover from her mess-up. Her throat felt tight, and it was hard to speak. "That we are." He stared at the doorway to the rest of the house, lost in thought, unaware that JoBeth felt she had insulted him. He turned and graced her with his beautiful smile. "We all babes lost in this great big old world. Well, let's see. Carter and Adam are the oldest of the group. They's 18 and the best of friends you ever saw. Then there's Alan." JoBeth eased up and felt her throat relax. It was impossible for her not to notice Jonah's face light up with worship with the mention of Alan. "Alan's 16, and Oliver, the wildcat." Jonah could not help but radiate as he spoke fondly of his only family. "He's 15. Todd, he's 14. He's also Adam's brother. He's mighty shy, so don't you be getting upset and hurt if he don't speak to you." Jonah wagged a finger seriously in JoBeth's face. She shook her head, amused, forgetting her earlier shame. "And we can't forget Tamara. Beautiful Tamara. She's at the lovely age of 15. And I'm 16 too." Shauna stirred, waking up. She rubbed her eyes in the familiar way JoBeth had become accustomed to. "Well, if the sun hasn't shined right in this very room." Jonah beamed, standing up and walking toward Shauna. She quickly backed away from him, frightened. She had lived all of her life with Mother Tomalina and Father James. It was hard to remove a lifetime of learned racism in just one night. The messages the Johnstons seeded in Shauna's brain since infancy had taken plant and rooted on her shoulders for so long. "There's nothing to fear from old Jonah, little girl. Now look here." JoBeth watched curiously as the boy searched in his pants pocket for something. Shauna eyed him with distrust. "I saved this just for you," Jonah said, handing Shauna a large, shiny red apple. "Just for your breakfast. A growing girl such as yourself needs an apple a day to keep the doctor away." He chuckled, handing Shauna the red fruit. She held the fleshy apple, her eyes feasting on the red color. She looked at JoBeth for approval, and JoBeth nodded, smiling. Without a hesitation, she took the apple and bit into it. It's good." She beamed up at Jonah, apple juice running down her chin. "Thank you." She bit into it again. The sounds of crunching rang through the room, and all fears of Jonah vanished with each sweet bite. "You are welcome, and since you love my apples, I will bring you one every day," Jonah said, standing up. He picked up Shauna and walked back to JoBeth. JoBeth reached her arms out for the little urchin and placed the apple child between the two of them. "JoBeth?" Jonah asked, handing each of them more bread. "Yes?" She placed the bread in her lap, wiping away some breadcrumbs that had fallen onto her dress. "I always wants to know what a body wants out of this great big old world. And I wants to know what you want, too." He looked at JoBeth sincerely. She knew he was serious about this question, and it made her uncomfortable. She had given up all her hopes and expectations of the world. "What do you want?" JoBeth countered back, teasing, trying to avoid his questioning face. "Oh, I don't know." Jonah's face puzzled up like an old rotten apple. "I guess I want people to see me and accept me as Jonah, not the poor black trash. Just Jonah." He looked at JoBeth with wide, wet eyes. "See, I got 2 strikes against me. I's black, and I ain't got no one but a bunch of white kids as family." "But that is better than being any color and all alone." JoBeth spoke softly. She felt for the man-child beside her. She knew what loneliness was, and it did not discriminate. On the contrary, it attracted everyone it could. Jonah saw JoBeth's fallen face and the sadness plainly displayed there. People's troubles come in all forms, he thought. He perked up quickly, not wanting to darken this new encounter. "That's right, JoBeth. I knew you was meant to be a part of our family. I just knew it. I got a bad habit of getting down on myself, and the group is always at me, reminding me of the good things in life. Just like you just done." JoBeth tickled Shauna, who giggled and bit into her half-eaten apple. It felt good to laugh. It had been a long time since she felt like laughing, when it felt safe to laugh. It might not be so bad to stay the winter with these people. They could not tell what Father James did to her. Besides, winter was nearly at the door, and it would be good to spend the cold nights talking to Jonah. Maybe with time, she would even become friends with Tamara. She allowed herself to be content, if not happy. Perhaps she could put the horror of the Johnston household behind her. Maybe she could forget and go on with her life. "Now, quit trying to change the subject. You tell me what you'd like out of life." Jonah scowled playfully.
"I'd like to be as free as a birdie,"
Shauna tittered. It was hard to believe that Shauna had once been a frightened little phantom, afraid of her own shadow. She had really transformed into a new little girl. "Me too," JoBeth said dreamily. "I would like to fly away where no one would ever find me, like a deserted island. I would eat wild berries and drink from a clear crystal stream. Then I would dive into its cool depths and be forever clean." She blushed, embarrassed. Shauna and Jonah listened intently. Jonah gently placed his hand on JoBeth's knee, cupping her hand in his. His grasp was comforting and reassuring. "We have the same dreams," he whispered. Stillness enveloped the room. "How did you meet up with these people, Jonah?" JoBeth coughed nervously. The silence between them had grown uncomfortable. "Well," Jonah began, ripping his bread in two and handing half to Shauna. She took it greedily and began to munch down on it. "I was 3 when my ma died, and a few years later, my pa died of a bad heart. I believe that it was a broken heart. He was always a silent man. But after ma died of her heartaches, he seemed to become even quieter, into himself. I didn't have no brothers and sisters on account of ma nearly dying having me. Pa said it messed her insides up pretty bad. Anyway, I was just wandering around, nearly starved, when I met up with these boys. Most have the same story. Some different. Some have been on their own as young as Shauna." He ruffled the little girl's hair as she rolled her eyes up at him. "Yeah, Tamara's been on her own since she was 7. I don't know much about Alan. He's pretty tight-lipped about his past." A strange feeling began to wrap around her. Why was the boy Alan so secretive about his past? But then again, she did not want anyone to know about her sordid history. She pushed the mystery of Alan's previous life out of her mind. What did she care about a boy she did not know? JoBeth had enough to think about with Shauna and herself. She did not need to worry about Alan and his secrets. The door suddenly burst open, causing the 3 to jerk clear out of their seats. Oliver swayed in the doorway, a sloppy grin stretching across his face. His eyes glassy and unfocused, the odor of cheap alcohol floated from him as he laughed. JoBeth gasped, grabbing a hold of Shauna's arm, her heart pounding. His slurred words seemed to seep into the room like smoke, sending a chill down her spine. She tightened her grip on Shauna instinctively as Oliver stumbled closer. "No need to dent the roof." He careened through the doorway, barely missing JoBeth. Instinctively, she flinched. A flashback of Father James filled her vision. For a moment, she felt like screaming. The image of Father James' fat, stubby hands reaching out to her flashed in her mind. She quickly shook it away when Alan stepped forward, a fierce expression covering his face as he grabbed Oliver by the collar of his shirt, yanking Oliver off his feet away from JoBeth.
What? What did I do?
Oliver looked confused and a little hurt. Alan's eyes flashed, his fists clenched at his sides. JoBeth felt fear wash over her as Alan's gaze drilled into the drunken Oliver sitting stunned on the floor. Her head bowed, cheeks flaming, as Alan's sharp voice cut through the air. Learn how to handle your whiskey, or I will teach you how. Oliver stood, trying to keep his balance. He stumbled forward, his face twisted in a sulk, to Tamara still standing in the doorway, frowning at JoBeth.
Hey, baby,
he slurred, wrapping a limp arm around her shoulders. A pink tongue protruded out of his mouth and darted into her ear. Tamara grimaced, unimpressed.
How about it, honey? I need a little lovin', and I know how you can fill it.
He leaned over and planted a boozy kiss on the nape of her neck. A shiver ran up Tamara's spine. Softening, she gazed down at Oliver's tousled black hair. She had a weak spot for his good looks and beautiful blue eyes. Eyes she now noticed, trying to focus on the shaken JoBeth. Fury that always seemed to fill her snapped free. Tamara turned around so fast that Oliver did not have time to duck, and her hand smashed into the side of his flushed face.
Pig!
She shrilled so loud that Shauna leapt into JoBeth's lap.
You don't talk to me that way, or I will do more than slap you. I knows how to do that, too,
Tamara hollered. She stormed over to Alan, who was taking food out of the inside of his jacket.
Enough, Oliver,
Alan declared, shifting his attention to Tamara as she took out the food she had concealed in her coat. He avoided looking at JoBeth. Oliver shook his head, touching the side of his face where Tamara's handprint was already hot and red. He went to the nearest mattress and lay down, not understanding what had come over Tamara. Alan spoke, with his eyes cast downward, studying the items of food placed on the table. He tried to avoid eye contact while speaking.
We got a ham and a dozen eggs,
he said, gesturing towards the pile.
Plus, Carter and Adam got some other stuff. We gotta be careful from now on. They're starting to watch us closer.
He looked up briefly to Tamara and returned his gaze back down.
You women can go and begin cooking this meat.
He avoided JoBeth's fixed look. He could read the disapproval on her face, and it made him feel small. He was sure JoBeth had never stolen for her supper. It was plain to see in her eyes. Alan was sure he was right.
She thinks I'm trash,
he thought, ashamed and humiliated.
She is too good for us, for me.
Come on, Tamara said miserably as she picked up the ham and slung it loosely by her side. She did not even bother looking at JoBeth as she trudged out the door. JoBeth started slowly standing up and following the raven-haired beauty, unsure what to do.
JoBeth?
A small voice questioned. JoBeth wheeled around. She had forgotten about Shauna. The poor thing looked frightened as a scarecrow. Tears had begun to roll out the corners of her eyes, and her bottom lip started to tremble.
Am I a woman? Do I go too?
She choked, trying not to cry. Do you want to come? JoBeth asked, feeling bad. Her mind had been on Alan's stealing and Tamara's insolence. Shauna was her responsibility. She should not concern herself with how Alan and Tamara lived their lives. Shauna will be eating tonight, eating until she was completely filled up. What did it matter where the food came from or how it had landed on their plates? It only mattered that it was there. JoBeth could not believe she had let herself forget about the little girl. She was going to have to be more careful. These people were temporary, and this place was only a pit stop for the winter. Shauna was permanent, her whole future. Shauna nodded her head up and down, replacing her frown with a smile. She was like Jonah and the handsome Oliver. but she wasn't prepared to be apart from JoBeth just yet. "Then come along," JoBeth coaxed, holding out her hand. Shauna grinned and jumped up from the mattress, running to JoBeth.
"You's in charge, Shauna," Jonah said, pointing. "Don't let those two diddle-daddle with our feast."
"I won't,"
she beamed, her chest rising with importance. Behind the broken-down house, Tamara was already building a fire. Ash covered the ground. Black charcoal rocks and burnt twigs were arranged in a circle. The wooden walls of the building were neatly stacked with logs. Tamara had already brought 3 good-sized pieces beside the circle. "Shauna, honey," Tamara said, her voice surprisingly sweet. The young child looked at her fearfully, grabbing the hem of JoBeth's frayed skirt.
"If'n you want to play, I have some pretty dolls up in the house by my mattress, just waiting to be played with by some beautiful girl just like you. You see, they happen to be lonely. No one's played with them for a long time."
An ecstatic smile spread across Shauna's face. Dolls had never been a part of her life. Such indulgence was not acceptable to Mother Tomalina. "Go play," JoBeth coaxed, thinking maybe Tamara was all bark and no bite. Shauna giggled and ran off excitedly into the ramshackle house. She quickly returned moments later with 3 porcelain dolls. They were beautifully made, with real human hair as blonde as corn silk. Their faces were delicately painted with happy smiles. The dolls, JoBeth noticed, were well taken care of, their dresses clean and bright. Shauna sat down on the grass, a little way away from the other girls, and began playing. Tamara's fire had started to take, and she was preparing a spit to roast the ham.
"If you're gonna stay, you better learn to cook,"
Tamara said, glaring at JoBeth. She ignored the look.
"Everyone has to work. Ain't no room for one living off the others here."
"I can work," JoBeth spoke bitterly, poking a stick into the ground. The sight of the ham, which had caused her stomach to growl moments ago, now made it churn. Her breast began to throb, and she wondered if her monthly would soon start. She glanced at Tamara, putting the ham on the spit. It looked red, and the smell of raw pork started to repulse her. Her mouth began to water, and bile rose in her throat suddenly. Turning to the bushes, she quietly spat up the bread Jonah had given her for breakfast. Tamara watched out of the corner of her eye. She had been ready to argue with JoBeth about leaving her duties when she noticed her throwing up. Tamara turned back to her cooking. She hated being sick, but she was only briefly concerned for JoBeth. She didn't like the scrawny gal invading her home. The little one, Shauna, was all right. She knew only too well what it was like to be so young and alone. "Sorry," JoBeth said, returning to Tamara, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "I haven't been around solid food for so long that I'm afraid my stomach can't handle it." Tamara nodded, not bothering to look at JoBeth's waxen face. There was too much attention paid to the gaunt, stringy-haired girl by Oliver. For the life of her, she did not see why. She thought JoBeth's hazel eyes were too big, her hair was too straight, and an awful mousy color. Unlike Tamara's curvy frame, JoBeth was built like a skinny child. In Tamara's mind, there was no doubt that she turned many men's and even some women's eyes. It's always been that way. It was just a fact, and Oliver had been no different. She let him have her a few times. What did it matter to Tamara? Sex was nothing new. She had always been surrounded by it. She was born in a brothel. Her mother, a black-haired beauty like Tamara, had been the favored prostitute of the establishment. Madame Keisha, the painted, red-haired woman who owned the Pleasure Hotel, had pulled the bloody, screaming Tamara from between the quivering legs of Lorraine, her mother. It had been a cold winter night, and the room was so frigid that a hazy mist steamed from Tamara's wet body. Her balled-up fist struck out angrily at the world. Madame Keisha placed the infant on her mother's working bed, the very bed Tamara had been conceived on, and looked up at the exhausted Lorraine. It had been a hard and long labor. Madame Keisha expected both mother and child to die. She was still afraid that her most popular girl would. Her business would not be as prosperous without Lorraine. Her beauty was something clients only dreamed of and paid high prices for, even if it was only for a night. "It's a girl," Madame Keisha said, looking down at the squirming infant shivering in the cold. Little puffs of cool air blew out of her wailing blue lips. "She should have died," Lorraine whispered weakly on her side. A tear ran down her sweaty, pasty face. "Who will marry a whore's daughter? She will be nothing more than a slab of meat for some man to pant over. Like mother, so will be the daughter," Lorraine sobbed. Madame Keisha lifted the wiggling Tamara to her mother's breast. Lorraine wished she could have feelings for the infant. Her body bore the child, but Lorraine could not love her. She did not even know who the child's pa was. He could be any of the foul-smelling rogues who frequented the establishment. The thought of men who came to pleasure themselves on her made Lorraine sick. This child was a product of one of those encounters. Lorraine had hoped that maybe it had been one of the wealthier clients, maybe even one of the young virgin boys whose daddy or older brother had treated them on a birthday. She was an expensive product. It was something to relax her mind for a moment, but there were the few scoundrels who, captivated by her beauty, spent a month's salary just to pump her for a few moments of pleasure. The thought that one of these men could have fathered this child who grew inside her sickened her. The baby cried angrily, begging to be fed. Lorraine placed a hard nipple into the child's mouth to stop the fury of the infant. She laid her head down upon her pillow, feeling her child feed from her, and cried. Tamara grew up watching her mother with countless men. She always craved the love Lorraine seemed to give them, and not her. Only when Tamara had been sick would Lorraine sit by her small bed beside her mother's and feed her soup, humming a tuneless hymn. When Tamara was 7, her mother was killed. She had told a favored customer that she was pregnant. The man was enraged and strangled Lorraine while Tamara slept peacefully beside them. Tamara never cried when Madame Keisha and 2 other girls who worked for her removed her mother's limp corpse from the stained sheets of the bed. Madame Keisha pulled Tamara aside after her mother's body had been taken away. "Your mother has left us, child. It is a great loss to my business, but she did have you, and you will garner a great price. The beautiful daughter of Lorraine, even more beautiful than she, and still pure. You will be my greatest profit." The heavily made-up woman spoke, her eyes visibly calculating the income that would come in with the price of Tamara's virginity. "I will auction you off to the highest bidder. The gentleman will bid very high for your young beauty and unspoiled body." Tamara said nothing. She was aware of the virgin auctions. She had no intention of having the filthy creatures who groaned naked over her mother do the same to her. That very night, when the brothel was packed with customers and laughter, Tamara slipped out of the establishment when everyone was too busy to notice. Madame Keisha never saw her again. Tamara exhaled. Those were long-ago days. She survived, sometimes by the very means she had run away from. Men seemed to desire her, wanted to possess her. Tamara just shrugged it off. They could have her body if she needed money, but they would never possess her. Eventually, years later, she met Carter, Adam, and Todd. They treated her like one of them. She felt she belonged to a family for the first time in her life. Others joined the group, some left and some stayed. Although a few boys felt they could have Tamara, she had never allowed it. Until Oliver showed up, so handsome and charming. She never minded lying in his arms. In fact, she loved the way he touched and caressed her. She glanced over at JoBeth and noticed her pallor. "What do you have against me, Tamara?" JoBeth breathed heavily, the back of her hand pressed against her moist mouth. "Nothing." Tamara stiffly turned away. Guilt kept surfacing in her conscience. She turned the ham, which had begun to release a delicious aroma. "Don't lie. You don't like me. If you just got to know me, we could be friends." It would be better for the two girls to be friends. When JoBeth's monthly started, she would like a girlfriend to confide in about womanly woes. "We are living together. I just thought we might as well get along with each other, instead of being at each other's throats." Tamara's lips curled into a cruel laugh. Her anger returned. She placed her hands on her rounded hips and spread her legs apart. "Hell, I don't need to like you." Black hair swept out behind her in defiance. Tamara was indeed an enchantress, one that JoBeth knew she would never be. Not that JoBeth was ugly. She had her own unique qualities. But Tamara was a gorgeous creature. "If you wants to know why I don't like you, well, I'll tell you. You nearly fainted when I swore. You think you're all high and mighty with your proper English. I bet you even went to school." Tamara was wild. She had seen JoBeth's type before. Even though she was dressed worse than her, she knew her type. The type of girl who whispered and laughed about Tamara. The type of girl who called her names for people like her mother. JoBeth was like those girls, and that was what attracted Oliver. JoBeth was no whore's daughter. "You don't belong to us. You ain't one of us. Go back wherever you came from." The ham started to burn unattended, giving off a charcoal smell. Smoke swirled up from the fire, mingling with JoBeth's tears, blinding her vision. "No!" She shrieked with all the force she had. Shauna and Tamara both jumped in union. Shauna dropped the dolls she was playing with and ran over to JoBeth, trembling like a leaf. JoBeth bent down and hugged her tight to her swollen breast. "I cannot. We can't ever go back. I am like you. I went to school when Mama and Pappy were alive. Yes, I liked it, but when they died, I went to live." JoBeth stopped. Shauna was sobbing, holding tightly to her waist. She took a deep breath and looked straight into Tamara's surprised face. "I have not been to school since my parents died. That was a lifetime ago. I was another person. Please, try and like me. I want us to be friends. I am not high and mighty. I am far from high and mighty. We can't leave. We just can't. And you will just have to live with that, whether you want to or not." JoBeth's back felt naked as she stretched herself straight. Tamara would not defeat her. She would never be beaten by anyone again. She hugged Shauna defensively and began to whisper comforts into her ear. Shauna had become the little sister she never had, the little sister to replace the little brother she lost. If only Tamara knew what had happened to them, to JoBeth, she may be more understanding. Maybe Tamara wouldn't be so mean. JoBeth tightened her lips angrily. She would never tell anyone about the horrors of her recent past, especially Tamara. Tamara watched as Shauna whimpered, clutching JoBeth around the neck. JoBeth's outburst astonished and amused her. There might be some guts in her after all. "Stop your blabbering. I guess I can try to stomach your skinny old bones." She began to turn the burning ham, avoiding the two clinging figures behind her. "S'pose it ain't your fault the way ya is. Just don't get all mushy on me. I just ain't the mushy sort." "No, you are definitely not the mushy type." She swelled with hope, giving Shauna a squeeze. Maybe things might finally start to turn around for the better.